The autumn sun hung low over the sprawling Connecticut campus, its golden light stretching across the playground, where children's laughter usually floated freely. But today, amid the joyful noise, one small voice cracked with desperation. Ethan Carter, just 8 years old, pressed his back against the chain-link fence as 3 boys surrounded him. His wide brown eyes shimmered with tears, and his thin hands trembled as he clutched his backpack straps. "Please stop," Ethan cried, his voice breaking in the crisp air. "It hurts! Just stop!" His plea carried through the yard, sharp and raw, but the boys only smirked. To them, Ethan wasn't just another kid. He was the son of Richard Carter, the man whose name appeared on gleaming billboards across Manhattan. They didn't see a boy. They saw wealth wrapped in fragile silence, and that made him an easy target. If you're new here, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. Stories like this reveal not only the struggles hidden behind closed doors, but also the triumphs that can emerge when hearts change. Ethan's tears blurred the figures around him. One of the boys shoved him lightly, enough to jolt his small frame, but not enough to draw the attention of teachers scattered at a distance. His throat tightened. He wanted to run, but his legs felt heavy. Every part of him wanted to disappear. For Ethan, this wasn't just another schoolyard confrontation. It was the echo of something deeper, an ache that pulsed every evening in the vast Carter mansion where silence spoke louder than words. His father, Richard, spent nights on business calls, his voice commanding across speakerphones, while Ethan sat quietly in his room, listening to the hum of luxury without a single word of comfort. Ethan wasn't spoiled. He didn't crave expensive toys or grand vacations. What he wanted was far simpler: someone to notice when his voice shook, someone to sit beside him and listen. The boy's laughter stung because it reminded him of what he lacked most, a sense of belonging. The playground seemed to close in around him, the world blurred into colors of autumn leaves, the metallic tang of the fence pressing against his back, and the taste of fear rising in his throat. He remembered his grandmother's words, whispered just the night before as she tucked him into bed. "You're stronger than you think, Ethan. Don't let anyone make you feel small." But how could he believe that now, cornered, with no one coming to his defense? His eyes darted toward the school building. Teachers stood in groups chatting, pretending not to see. Parents' donations built this campus, and the Carter's name meant politics the staff didn't want to touch. The silence of authority weighed just as heavy as the jeers of his peers. Inside Ethan's chest, a storm swirled: shame, fear, anger. He thought of his father's tall figure, sharp suit, and distant gaze. Richard Carter could command boardrooms filled with seasoned executives, yet his son doubted he'd ever truly look into his eyes and understand. The chant of one boy cut through his thoughts. "What's the matter, rich boy? Gonna cry all the way home in your limo?" The others laughed. Ethan's face burned, but he kept pleading, his words trembling. "Please, just leave me alone." The moment stretched, painfully slow, as if time itself hesitated. And yet within Ethan, something quietly stirred, a flicker of defiance buried beneath his tears, waiting for the right moment to surface. This was just the beginning. The pain he carried today would set into motion a change neither Ethan nor his father could yet imagine. Because soon, the man who thought he could buy the world would be forced to confront the one thing his money could never repair: the heart of his son. And that confrontation was closer than either of them realized. In the heart of Manhattan, glass towers gleamed beneath the late afternoon sun, reflecting a city that pulsed with relentless ambition. Inside one of those towers, on the 38th floor, Richard Carter stood at the head of a long mahogany table. The boardroom smelled faintly of leather and fresh polish, the air humming with tension as men and women in tailored suits waited for his word. Richard didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His presence carried an authority honed through years of building Carter real estate into a powerhouse. "If we secure the Riverside project," he declared, tapping a thick folder on the table, "we won't just dominate the market in New Jersey. We'll redefine luxury living along the entire East Coast." Polite applause followed. His sharp blue eyes flickered, though not with joy, more with calculation. To him, every deal was a chess move, every handshake a step toward securing not just wealth, but legacy. Yet behind that polished exterior lay a man who barely noticed how much of his life had slipped into spreadsheets and contracts. His days began before dawn with black coffee in a crystal mug, followed by endless calls, meetings, and negotiations. Nights ended with a glass of scotch in the quiet of his penthouse, the city stretching before him like a conquest he had already claimed. Richard believed problems were solved with resources. If someone needed something, he provided it. Money, influence, connections, it was all there at his fingertips. But when it came to Ethan, those tools felt useless, though he hadn't yet admitted it. Across the city, in a quieter corner of Connecticut, his mother saw the truth more clearly than he did. Margaret Carter, silver-haired but sharp-eyed, had raised Richard in modest beginnings before his empire consumed their family name. She worried that her son, so consumed by ambition, was repeating the very cycle that had once left him aching for a father's approval. When Richard visited her one Sunday evening, his phone still buzzing with unread emails, she greeted him with the kind of steady calm that unsettled him more than any corporate rival. The kitchen smelled of roasted chicken, herbs filling the air. Ethan sat quietly at the table, scribbling in a notebook, barely glancing at his father. "Work again?" Margaret asked, her tone firm, but not unkind. Richard adjusted his cufflinks, avoiding her gaze. "It's important, Mother. You know how much is at stake." "What's at stake?" she countered. "Is sitting right there." She gestured toward Ethan, whose pencil scratched softly against paper. For a moment, silence stretched between them. Richard's jaw tightened. He has everything he needs: a home, the best school, opportunities most children would dream of. Margaret sighed, placing a hand on the wooden table, her fingers tracing the grooves of decades of family meals. "You gave him the world, Richard, but not yourself. He doesn't need another gift. He needs a father." Richard's chest rose with irritation, but the words clung to him even as he brushed them off. He poured himself a glass of water, the sound of it filling the quiet kitchen. "I'll do what I can, but you know how demanding my work is." Ethan finally looked up, his eyes large and searching, though he said nothing. That silence unsettled Richard more than any accusation could. Driving back to the city that night, headlights streaking across the highway, Richard told himself he was doing it all for Ethan, for the Carter name, for their future. Yet Margaret's words gnawed at him, clashing with the steel certainty he carried in boardrooms. Somewhere inside, though buried deep, a part of him wondered, what if she was right? The answer to that question would come sooner than he imagined, and in ways that would shake his certainty to its core. The halls of Fairview Academy smelled faintly of polished wood and chalk dust, the kind of scent that clung to old, prestigious schools where tradition carried as much weight as education. Children bustled between classes, their laughter echoing against the tiled floors. But for Ethan Carter, every step down those corridors felt heavier than the last. He clutched his books close to his chest, shoulders hunched, trying to shrink himself into invisibility. The other kids didn't let him. Whispers trailed after him like shadows. "There goes the Carter kid," one boy muttered. "Bet his dad bought the science lab," another sneered. "Imagine being so rich you don't need friends," a girl added, her tone sharp with mockery. Ethan kept walking, his ears burning. He wanted to shout that he wasn't like that his life wasn't the fantasy they imagined. But he knew better. Speaking up only made him more of a target. In class, he chose the desk by the window, where sunlight streamed in and allowed him to drift into daydreams. Numbers blurred on the chalkboard as his teacher explained fractions, her voice fading into background noise. Ethan's mind wandered to the soccer field outside, the wind brushing across the grass, a place he longed to feel free yet rarely did. "Ethan?" The teacher's voice cut through his thoughts, firm but not unkind. "Would you solve this one for us?" Dozens of eyes turned toward him. His throat tightened. He glanced at the equation, simple enough, but the pressure of their stares froze him. His pencil slipped in his sweaty hand. I don't know," he whispered. Snickers erupted across the room. The teacher sighed, moving on quickly, but Ethan sank lower in his chair. He wasn't stupid. He knew the answer. but courage deserted him whenever he felt the weight of those judging eyes. After class, he lingered by his locker, fumbling with the combination until a familiar voice pierced the air. "Hey, Carter," Tyler called, leaning casually against the lockers nearby. Tyler was different from the other boys. He wasn't cruel in the same way, though his teasing often stung. His tone carried curiosity rather than malice. "Why don't you ever say anything back? You just let them walk all over you." Ethan kept his gaze on the metal dial, spinning it aimlessly. "It's easier that way." Tyler tilted his head, studying him. "Easier, maybe, but not better." "They only keep picking because you never push back." Ethan shrugged, closing the locker with a soft clang. He didn't know how to explain the knot in his chest, the fear that speaking up would only make things worse. Outside, on the playground, the divide between him and the others grew clearer. Groups clustered together, trading jokes and laughter, while Ethan sat on a bench alone, tracing shapes into the dirt with the toe of his shoe. He longed to join, to be part of their world, but invisible walls seemed to rise around him, built from both their prejudice and his own quiet nature. The worst moments weren't always the loud ones. Sometimes it was the silence, when he entered a room and conversations hushed, or when he sat at lunch with no one beside him. Loneliness pressed down harder than insults ever could. Yet even within that loneliness, a flicker of resilience stirred. He noticed Tyler watching him sometimes, not with cruelty, but with something Ethan couldn't quite name. Maybe curiosity. Maybe the beginning of understanding. Still, the days stretched long, each filled with the same cycle of whispers, avoidance, and quiet endurance. Ethan carried the weight of it home each afternoon, the burden invisible but heavy enough to bend his small shoulders. What he didn't yet realize was that these struggles, painful as they were, would soon force him toward a turning point he could not avoid. The Carter estate loomed with its stone walls and polished floors, but Ethan always felt a chill inside its vast, echoing rooms. It wasn't the kind of place where laughter lingered in the halls. That warmth waited for him at his grandmother's house, just a short drive away but a world apart. Margaret Carter's home smelled of cinnamon and old books, the kind of scent that wrapped itself around you the moment you stepped through the door. Her living room was filled with knitted blankets draped over the couch, framed family photos that told stories of decades past, and shelves stacked with novels she still read late into the night. Here, Ethan could breathe. "Take off those shoes, sweetheart," Margaret called as Ethan entered, her voice both commanding and tender. "I just mopped the floor and I won't have you tracking dirt in." Ethan obeyed, kicking off his sneakers with a small smile. "Sorry, Grandma." She tousled his hair as he passed, her hand warm and grounding. "That's better. Now come sit. I've got cookies cooling." The kitchen table was always ready, set with mismatched plates and a jug of milk. Ethan bit into a cookie, the chocolate chip still soft, and felt the knot in his chest loosen. Margaret sat across from him, her eyes sharp, watching him more closely than anyone else did. "You've been quiet lately," she said gently. "Quieter than usual." Ethan shrugged, picking at a crumb. "It's nothing." Her gaze didn't waver. "Ethan, I've known you since the day you were born. I can tell when something weighs on you." The words tumbled out before he could stop them. "They don't like me at school. They say things, and I don't know how to make it stop." His voice cracked on the last word. Margaret reached across the table, placing her hand over his small one. "Oh, my dear boy," she murmured. "Children can be cruel, especially when they don't understand you. But you are stronger than you realize." Ethan's eyes filled with tears. "I don't feel strong, I just feel small." She leaned back, her gaze drifting to a photo on the wall, Richard as a boy, dressed in hand-me-down clothes, his expression serious even then. "Do you know," she began softly, "your father wasn't always the man you see now. When he was your age, he was teased too. Not because of money, but because he had none. The other children mocked him for his old shoes, for bringing sandwiches wrapped in the same paper day after day. He hated it, but he endured." Ethan blinked, surprised. "Dad? People made fun of him?" Margaret nodded. "Yes, and he promised himself he would rise above it." He worked harder than anyone else, and he built a life he thought would protect his family. But in doing so, he forgot something important. The heart needs more than success. It needs presence. Ethan's chest tightened. He wanted to believe her, but the image of his father's cold suits and endless phone calls clashed with the boy she described. Still, a seed of understanding took root. Margaret smiled faintly. You don't have to fight the way he did. You don't have to build walls around yourself. Your strength lies in kindness, Ethan. Don't let their cruelty steal that from you. The evening stretched in comfort. They played cards at the dining table, laughter bubbling up when Ethan won a round. Later, Margaret tucked him under a quilt on her couch, reading aloud from an old adventure book. Her voice carried him into dreams not of fear, but of courage. For Ethan, these moments weren't just visits. They were lifelines, reminders that even when the world seemed unkind, he was not alone. And though he didn't yet know it, her words would echo in his heart when he needed them most. The sky was overcast that afternoon, the kind of heavy grey that pressed down on the playground like a lid. The wind rustled through the bare branches at the edges of the field, carrying with it the sound of sneakers scuffing against asphalt and the sharp bark of children's laughter. For Ethan, those sounds meant dread. He had tried to avoid the group all day, keeping his head low and slipping from class to class without meeting anyone's eyes. But as the final recess bell rang, he felt the shift, the way footsteps fell in behind him, the low chuckles that followed. By the time he reached the swings, 3 boys had already closed in. Well, look who's all alone again, one of them taunted, stepping forward with a smirk. His name was Connor, taller than most kids their age, with a confidence born not from kindness, but from knowing others would laugh at whatever he said. What's the matter, Carter? Daddy too busy to buy you some friends? Ethan's stomach tightened. He gripped the strap of his backpack as if it were a shield. Just leave me alone, he said, his voice soft but steady. Another boy, Jake, snorted. Oh, come on. We're just having fun. Don't be such a baby. He gave Ethan's shoulder a shove, not hard enough to knock him down, but enough to send his heart racing. The third boy, Oliver, circled around behind him, boxing him in. Betty cries again. He always does. Their laughter felt louder than the whole playground. Ethan's chest burned. He wanted to disappear into the cracks of the pavement. Instead, his voice cracked under the weight of fear and shame. Please stop, he pleaded, tears welling in his eyes. It hurts, just stop. His words trembled in the cold air. For a split second, the boys hesitated, as if his raw desperation unsettled them. But then Connor laughed again, brushing it aside. Pathetic, he muttered, turning to the others. He's not even worth it. Teachers stood at a distance, watching but not moving closer. Their eyes flicked toward the scene and then away again. Confronting the children of wealthy parents was never simple. The unspoken rules of the school held them still, and Ethan knew better than to expect help. He blinked through tears, his body rigid with helplessness. Every cruel word felt like a stone piled on his chest, making it harder to breathe. His grandmother's voice echoed faintly in his memory. You are stronger than you realize. But strength felt impossible when his knees trembled. Then a new sound cut through the air, the deep rumble of a car pulling into the lot. A sleek black sedan rolled up, polished so bright it reflected the dull sky. The driver's door swung open, and Richard Carter stepped out, his presence commanding even from across the yard. At first, Ethan didn't notice. His eyes were on the ground, fighting tears. But the boys did. Their laughter faltered as they caught sight of the tall figure striding across the pavement, coat billowing slightly in the wind. Ethan! Richard's voice rang out, firm and sharp. Ethan's head snapped up. His father's eyes were locked on him, but not just on him, on the boys still standing too close. Richard's jaw tightened, and when he spoke again, his voice boomed across the playground. That's enough! The command froze everything. The boys stiffened, their bravado collapsing under the weight of a man who radiated authority. Even the nearby chatter of other children fell silent. Richard's gaze shifted from the boys to his son, and for the first time in a long while, Ethan saw something different in his father's eyes. Not just anger, not just control. Something closer to recognition, as if Richard was finally seeing what his son endured. Ethan's heart pounded. Relief washed through him, tangled with a swirl of shame and longing. He had cried again, but this time his father had heard him. And that changed everything. The principal's office smelled faintly of coffee and paper, the kind of stale scent that came from too many meetings behind closed doors. Richard Carter sat across from Principal Andrews, his tall frame leaning forward, eyes sharp as steel. Ethan sat quietly beside him, shoulders hunched, eyes on the floor. Richard's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "I just watched 3 boys surround my son, mock him, shove him and reduce him to tears. And you, this entire institution, did nothing." Principal Andrews, a man with thinning hair and a nervous smile, lifted his hands in a placating gesture. "Mr. Carter, please, we take all incidents seriously, but children sometimes exaggerate." Recess disagreements. Richard's fist struck the desk, making papers jump. "Do not insult my intelligence. I know what I saw. This isn't a disagreement. This is bullying." Ethan flinched at the sound, not at his father's anger, but at the weight of being the reason for it. He wanted the ground to swallow him. He didn't want to be the problem that dragged his father out of boardrooms into places like this. Principal Andrews cleared his throat. "We will, of course, look into the matter, but you must understand, Mr. Carter, these are sensitive situations. The families involved, well, some of them are significant contributors to the school." Richard's jaw clenched. "So donations buy immunity? Is that what you're telling me?" The principal shifted uncomfortably. "Not at all, but we strive to handle conflicts delicately so as not to—" "Delicacy," Richard snapped, his voice rising. "My son stood on that playground begging for it to stop, and no one lifted a finger. Tell me, Principal Andrews, how delicate do you think that felt to him?" Ethan's chest tightened. He wished he could disappear. His father's words were right, but the fury behind them made him feel exposed, like every shameful moment had been laid bare. Andrews tugged at his tie, trying to steady his composure. "We will address the children involved. I assure you disciplinary action will be taken." Richard leaned closer, his voice dropping, slow and deliberate. "If this school cannot protect its students, especially mine, then rest assured I will find one that can. And I will ensure the board knows exactly why enrollment and donations have dropped." The room went silent. Even the ticking clock on the wall seemed to pause. The principal's face paled, a bead of sweat forming at his temple. He nodded stiffly. "Understood. We'll take immediate steps." Richard sat back, his expression unyielding. He had won, as he always did. But when he turned to his son, expecting gratitude or even relief, Ethan's eyes held something else, embarrassment. In the car ride home, the silence between them was heavier than the roar of the city traffic outside. Richard finally broke it. "You don't have to endure this anymore, Ethan. I'll make sure they never touch you again." Ethan's fingers twisted in his lap. He stared out the window, his reflection faint against the glass. "You don't get it," he whispered. Richard frowned. "What don't I get?" "I stopped them." Ethan's voice cracked. "You didn't stop them. You just scared everyone. That's not the same thing." The words landed harder than Richard expected. He opened his mouth to argue, to remind Ethan of the power he wielded, but the boy's trembling shoulders silenced him. Richard gripped the steering wheel tighter, the city lights flashing across his face as they drove. For the first time in years, Richard Carter wondered if there were problems money and authority couldn't fix, and if so, how would he ever face them? The Carter dining room stretched long and gleaming, its polished mahogany table set with silver cutlery and crystal glasses that caught the glow of the chandelier above. Yet the space, grand as it was, felt colder than ever. Richard sat at the head of the table, Ethan to his right and Margaret across, her sharp eyes observing everything with quiet disapproval. The meal was roasted salmon, asparagus drizzled with lemon and a basket of fresh rolls. It could have been a feast, but the silence that blanketed the table made every bite feel like a chore. Ethan pushed his food around his plate, appetite gone. Richard finally broke the stillness, his voice clipped. "The matter at school has been handled. Those boys won't bother you again." Ethan didn't look up. He tore a roll in half, crumbs scattering across his plate. "That's not what I wanted." Richard set his fork down, frowning. "You wanted them to stop. I made sure they will." The boy's voice was small, but steady. "You didn't stop them, Dad. You just scared them. That doesn't change how they see me." The words stung more than Richard expected. He leaned back in his chair, jaw tight. "What matters is that you're safe." Margaret's voice cut in, calm but firm. "Safe, Richard, or silenced? There's a difference." Richard turned to her, irritation flashing. "Mother, please. He was being bullied. I did what any parent should." She folded her hands neatly on the table. "You did what you always do. You used power to solve a problem. But power doesn't teach Ethan how to stand on his own. It only teaches him that he must rely on you to fight his battles." Ethan's fork clinked against his plate as he dropped it. His face flushed with shame. "I don't want everyone to think I can't do anything without you." The admission hung heavy in the air. Richard's chest tightened. He wanted to defend himself, to remind his son of all he had sacrificed to give him everything, but the words caught in his throat. He glanced at Margaret, who held his gaze without blinking. "You can't buy your way into his heart," she said softly, almost as if repeating something she had told him before. Richard looked down at his plate. For the first time in years, he didn't know what to say. He felt the weight of his own silence pressing against him, as if it mirrored the same silence he had always left Ethan in. The rest of the meal dragged in strained quiet. Knives scraped plates, glasses clinked, but no one spoke. Richard stole glances at his son, noticing the slump of his shoulders, the way his small hands fidgeted with the napkin. Shame prickled in his chest, shame he had buried for too long. After dinner, Margaret rose and began clearing plates. Ethan excused himself without waiting for permission, his footsteps echoing down the marble hallway until the sound faded. Richard remained seated, staring at the empty chair beside him. "He doesn't understand," he muttered, almost to himself. Margaret returned, drying her hands on a towel. "No, Richard. You don't understand. You can close a deal worth millions, but you don't know how to sit with your son and simply be his father." Her words were neither cruel nor loud, but they pierced him deeper than any accusation. Richard rubbed his temples, the chandelier's light suddenly too harsh, the room too suffocating. That night, as he retreated to his study, the echo of his mother's voice stayed with him. For the first time, he wondered if all his victories had blinded him to the one place where he was failing most. The Saturday morning air carried the crisp bite of early spring, the kind that filled lungs with freshness and promised new beginnings. The soccer field stretched wide under a pale blue sky, the grass still damp from dew. Children in mismatched jerseys ran across it, laughter and shouts tumbling together in a kind of cheerful chaos. On the sidelines, Margaret sat with a blanket draped over her knees, her watchful eyes steady. Beside her, Richard stood stiffly in his tailored coat, looking out of place among the other parents in jeans and ball caps. He crossed his arms, as if bracing himself against more than just the wind. Ethan was on the field, his small frame dwarfed by the other kids. He shuffled nervously, his sneakers scuffing the grass as he avoided the ball whenever it came too close. The coach clapped his hands, urging the children forward. "Let's go, team, stay with the ball." Richard's brow furrowed. He was used to winning, to domination and precision. Watching his son hesitate made frustration rise in his chest, but then he caught Margaret's glance, firm, warning, and swallowed the words before they could leave his mouth. Ethan's moment came suddenly. The ball rolled toward him, wobbling through the grass. His teammates shouted, "Kick it, Ethan, kick it!" His heart pounded. His foot swung forward, but instead of striking cleanly, it grazed the ball, sending it spinning crookedly out of bounds. A ripple of laughter passed through the children. Ethan's cheeks flamed red as he froze in place, wishing the ground would swallow him. Richard's instinct was to clench his fists, to march onto the field, to demand perfection. But something in his son's hunched shoulders stopped him. He saw not failure, but fear. He remembered the look Ethan had given him at the dinner table, the quiet plea for understanding. Before he knew it, his voice carried across the field. "It's all right, Ethan, shake it off." You'll get the next one. The boy's head snapped up, startled. He hadn't expected encouragement, not from his father. For a brief second, the shame in his eyes flickered, replaced by surprise, maybe even hope. The game continued, clumsy and uneven, as youth soccer always was. Ethan didn't score a goal, didn't become the hero of the match, but he kept moving. He tried again. He chased the ball, missed, stumbled, and tried once more, and each time Richard clapped his hands and called out, "Good effort, keep going." Margaret watched quietly, her lips curving into a knowing smile. She had seen Richard dominate empires, but this was different. This was him learning to step back, to give instead of control. When the whistle finally blew, Ethan trudged toward the sidelines, sweaty and tired. He expected silence, maybe a critique. Instead, Richard knelt down to meet his eyes. "You did well today," he said. Ethan frowned, confused. "But I didn't score. I messed up." Richard shook his head. "Doesn't matter. You tried. You kept going. That's what matters." For the first time in weeks, Ethan let out a small laugh. "I almost tripped over the ball." Richard chuckled, the sound unfamiliar on his lips. "Then next time you'll trip a little less." It wasn't a grand victory, but it was something far greater. A beginning. A bridge forming between father and son, fragile but real. Ethan walked beside his father off the field, his steps lighter than they had been in a long time. For Richard, the moment lingered. Winning here didn't mean dominance, it meant presence. And for the first time, he wondered if this was the lesson he had been missing all along. The Carter Real Estate headquarters towered over Midtown Manhattan, its glass facade reflecting the restless city below. Inside, the boardroom buzzed with restrained urgency. The table was covered with folders, charts, and glowing laptops, all pointing toward the same subject, the Riverside Expansion Project. Richard sat at the head of the table, his posture commanding. His senior executives leaned forward, eager, voices overlapping as they pressed their arguments. "This deal secures dominance over the luxury housing market from Jersey City straight into Lower Manhattan," one man said, tapping a map with his pen. "If we move now, no competitor can touch us." Another added, "But it requires full commitment. Every ounce of our attention has to be here for the next 6 months, no distractions." Richard's jaw tightened. Distractions. He thought of Ethan on the soccer field, his tentative smile when Richard told him he was proud. For the first time, the word distraction didn't feel like something to brush aside. It felt like a choice he couldn't ignore. One of the investors, a sharp-tongued woman in a navy suit, spoke next. "We need your assurance, Richard. The board expects your full presence." "This is too big to risk on half measures." The air thickened with expectation. Everyone looked at him, waiting for the certainty he always provided. Normally, he thrived on this, the power of decisive words, the command that steadied others. But today, hesitation tugged at him. His phone buzzed on the table. A text lit the screen. Reminder, Ethan's school recital, 7 p.m. The timing felt cruel. He knew what the room expected, a promise that nothing would matter more than Riverside. Yet the thought of Ethan scanning the crowd, hoping for his father, only to find an empty seat, gnawed at him. Richard cleared his throat. "The project is promising," he began, voice steady, "but I need time to review the long-term implications. Growth without stability is reckless." A murmur of disapproval rippled through the room. One executive leaned forward. "With respect, Richard, hesitation could cost us. The competition is circling." Richard met his gaze coolly. "Then let them circle. We don't gamble Carter Real Estate's future on impulse." It was an answer that bought him time, but it left the board uneasy. The woman in the navy suit pressed again. "We've never seen you hesitate like this. What's changed?" Richard didn't answer. He rose from his chair, gathering his papers with deliberate calm. "Meeting adjourned. I'll have my decision soon." The executives exchanged looks, unsettled. Richard walked out, his polished shoes echoing in the marble hallway. His assistant hurried behind him. "Sir, the investors are expecting a firm commitment by tomorrow. Should I reschedule tonight's calls to prepare?" He paused, looking out at the skyline through the tall glass windows. The city stretched endless and glittering, the empire he had built brick by brick. And yet in his mind, he saw only Ethan's nervous hands clutching a sheet of paper, standing on a school stage, searching for his father in the crowd. "No," Richard said firmly. "Clear my schedule for tonight." The assistant blinked. "But sir," "I said clear it." His tone left no room for debate. As he stepped into the elevator, Richard felt the weight of the choice pressing against him. For the first time, he was turning away from a deal that could cement his dominance, all for something far less tangible. Yet somehow, it felt like the only decision that mattered. He didn't know what the consequences would be, whether the board would see him as weak, whether rivals would use this hesitation against him. But he knew one thing. He couldn't let Ethan face another moment of disappointment. And so as the elevator doors closed, Richard Carter prepared to choose his son over his empire. The auditorium buzzed with restless chatter, the kind that fills every corner before a school performance. Rows of folding chairs creaked under the weight of parents leaning forward, clutching programs, craning their necks to spot their children behind the stage curtains. The scent of polished wood mixed with the faint tang of stage paint. Backstage, Ethan Carter sat on a folding chair, his sheet of paper trembling in his hands. His part was small, just a short reading from a poem, but to him it felt like standing in front of the world. His chest rose and fell in shallow breaths, nerves threatening to undo him before he ever stepped onto the stage. Beside him, another boy whispered, "You're shaking. Gonna mess up." The words weren't cruel so much as careless, but they stung all the same. Ethan bit his lip, staring down at the paper until the letters blurred. The thought of stepping onto that stage and finding no one waiting for him in the audience pressed down on him harder than the lines he had to memorize. His father had missed so many moments before. Why should tonight be different? Out front, the lights dimmed and the principal welcomed families. The audience applauded politely. Richard Carter slipped in just as the program began, his dark coat trailing behind him. Margaret gave him a pointed look from her seat in the middle row, but said nothing. Richard settled beside her, his expression uncharacteristically tense, eyes fixed on the stage. When Ethan's turn came, his knees nearly buckled. He gripped the paper tighter, the edges crumpling under his fingers. He peeked out at the sea of faces, his stomach lurching, then froze. There, halfway back, was his father. Not on the phone, not absent, but seated upright, eyes locked on him. Richard didn't just look at the stage, he looked at Ethan, as though he were the only one in the room. Ethan's throat tightened. He almost turned and ran. Instead, he whispered, "I can't do this." The teacher nearby gave his shoulder a reassuring squeeze. "Yes, you can. Just breathe." Still, fear rooted him to the spot. That's when Richard stood. The audience murmured, curious, but Richard ignored them. He walked to the edge of the aisle, careful not to disrupt the performance, and spoke in a low, steady voice that only his son could hear. "You don't have to be perfect," Richard said. "Just be you. I'll be proud no matter what." The words hit harder than any applause. Ethan blinked, his chest loosening. Slowly, he stepped to the microphone, the paper trembling in his hands. His voice cracked on the first line, but he kept going. "The trees stood tall," he read, his voice gaining strength with each word. "Their roots deep, their branches wide, holding the sky like a promise." The audience grew still, listening. His small, shaky voice carried more power than he realized, because it was brave. By the time he finished, a quiet hush lingered in the air before the applause burst forth. Ethan lowered the paper, cheeks flushed. His eyes darted to the crowd again, and there was his father clapping louder than anyone, pride written plainly across his face. For Ethan, it wasn't about the poem anymore. It was about that look, the kind that said he was enough, not because of what he achieved, but because of who he was. When he returned backstage, he let out a shaky laugh, a weight lifted from his chest. For the first time in a long time, he felt something like freedom. And for Richard, sitting among the parents, the applause echoing around him, he realized he had finally made a choice worth keeping. The following week, the Carter Real Estate Board gathered again, this time in a private club off Fifth Avenue, a place where old money and new ambition collided over dark wood and crystal chandeliers. The air smelled of cigars and brandy, heavy with tradition and power. Richard entered the room with his usual confidence, but whispers had already spread among the men and women seated around the polished oak table. Charles Whitman, one of Richard's longest-standing partners, leaned back in his chair with a smirk that didn't reach his eyes. "I hear you missed the investor dinner, Richard." Riverside's financiers weren't pleased to dine without their host. Richard poured himself water, ignoring the decanter of whiskey pushed his way. "I had another commitment." Charles's eyebrow arched. "Another commitment? More pressing than locking in the most significant expansion in a decade?" Richard met his gaze evenly. "My son had a recital." "I was there." The room went quiet, the crackle of the fireplace filling the silence. Then a low chuckle spread among a few board members, not cruel but dismissive, as though Richard had admitted to chasing something childish. One man cleared his throat. "Family is important, of course, but Carter Real Estate has always been about vision and strength. Investors want assurance that nothing will compromise that." Richard's patience thinned. "Strength isn't abandoning your family for a contract. If they want a leader who can't balance both, they're welcome to look elsewhere." Charles leaned forward, his voice sharp. "That's the problem. They might. Hesitation reads as weakness, Richard, and weakness costs money." The words struck a nerve. Richard had built his empire on certainty, on the reputation that he never faltered. But as he looked around the table, at men who measured worth in numbers alone, he felt a strange detachment. For the first time, their priorities no longer aligned with his own. Margaret's warning echoed in his mind. "You can't buy your way into his heart." He set his glass down. "I'm not here to debate fatherhood with men who wouldn't recognize sacrifice if it stared them in the face. I made a choice to show up for my son, and I won't apologize for it." Charles's smirk hardened. "Careful, Richard. Sentiment is a dangerous thing in our world. Rivals can smell it like blood in the water." "Let them smell it," Richard shot back. "I'd rather lose an investor than lose my son." The declaration landed like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples across the room. Some executives shifted uncomfortably, others whispered, but no one dared challenge him further. Later, as Richard left the club and stepped into the brisk night air, he felt the weight of his words. He had drawn a line between himself and the men who had once stood shoulder to shoulder with him. He could already see the consequences: deals slipping away, calls unanswered, allies turning into critics. Yet, as the city lights flickered against the pavement, he also felt something unfamiliar, a quiet sense of relief. For once, he hadn't chosen power over the people who mattered. At home that evening, Ethan greeted him at the door holding a drawing from school. "Look, Dad," he said shyly, "I drew us at the recital." The picture was simple, crayon lines showing a small figure at a microphone and a taller one clapping in the crowd. Richard knelt to study it, his throat tightening. "That's me." Ethan nodded, his smile tentative. "You were really there?" For Richard, that affirmation was worth more than any contract or deal. The empire he had built might tremble, but in that moment, the foundation of something stronger was beginning to rise. The spring field trip was supposed to be a day of discovery and fun. Buses rumbled down country roads until they reached a nature reserve, where the air smelled of pine and damp soil. Teachers herded students toward picnic tables, handing out maps and instructions. Excitement buzzed in the air, but for Ethan Carter, unease simmered beneath the surface. He had hoped the trip might be different, new surroundings, new chances. But as soon as groups formed, the same boys who had haunted him on the playground cornered him near the trailhead. Connor's smirk was sharp as ever. "Well, look who thinks he's brave now. Just because Daddy yelled once doesn't mean you're safe." Jake chimed in, voice dripping with mockery. "Yeah, let's see what happens when Rich Boy doesn't have Daddy around." Ethan's stomach twisted, but something inside him had shifted since the recital. He remembered his father's words, "I'll be proud no matter what." That memory held him upright even as fear clawed at him. Connor shoved his shoulder lightly. "Say it again, say please stop. That's your favorite line, isn't it?" Ethan's chest tightened. For a moment, the old instinct surged. Stay quiet, shrink, wait for it to end. But this time he planted his feet. His voice trembled, but it carried. No. The boys blinked, taken aback. I'm not saying that anymore, Ethan continued louder now. His hands trembled, but his gaze didn't falter. I'm done letting you treat me like this. You don't get to decide who I am. The silence that followed was heavier than their laughter had ever been. For the first time, Ethan wasn't crying, he was standing. Connor scoffed, but his smirk faltered. Big talk. What are you going to do if we don't stop? Before Ethan could answer, another voice broke in. Tyler, who had been hovering nearby, stepped forward. He doesn't have to do anything, because he's right. You're just picking on him for no reason. The shift was subtle but undeniable. With Tyler's words, the balance of power cracked. The bullies exchanged uneasy glances, suddenly aware that the audience wasn't entirely on their side anymore. A teacher's whistle blew in the distance, and the boys stepped back with muttered excuses. Ethan's pulse pounded in his ears, his body buzzing with adrenaline. He had spoken, really spoken, and the world hadn't ended. The fear hadn't disappeared, but it hadn't crushed him either. Tyler gave him a small nod. Took you long enough. Ethan let out a shaky laugh. Guess I finally figured it out. The rest of the day felt different. The bullies kept their distance, and while Ethan didn't suddenly become the center of every group, he noticed something new. People looking at him not with pity but with a kind of quiet respect. Even Tyler stuck by his side during the hike, pointing out birds and trees with a grin that felt almost like friendship. As the bus rolled back toward town that evening, Ethan leaned against the window, the fading sunlight washing over his face. He wasn't the same boy who had once begged through tears for the cruelty to stop. Something had cracked open, and in its place grew a fragile but undeniable strength. For the first time, Ethan allowed himself to believe his grandmother's words. He was stronger than he thought. And soon, his father would see that too. The school gymnasium smelled faintly of varnished floors and popcorn from the concession stand. It was the spring showcase, an event where students displayed projects, artwork, and small performances. Parents clustered in groups, chatting over paper cups of coffee, while children tugged eagerly at sleeves to guide them toward their displays. Richard Carter stepped inside, his presence commanding as always, but this time he carried no phone, no briefcase, no air of distraction. He scanned the room until his gaze landed on Ethan, who was standing beside a trifold poster, decorated with sketches and handwritten notes about the life cycle of plants. For a moment, Richard saw not just his son, but a boy who had worked hard, who had braved laughter and loneliness, who had kept going. The sight pulled something deep inside him. Ethan looked up, surprise flickering in his eyes. "Dad, you came," Richard smiled faintly. "Of course I did. Show me what you've got." Ethan launched into an explanation, his voice carrying a mix of nerves and excitement. He pointed to the drawings, stumbling over a few words but never stopping. Richard listened intently, nodding, asking questions. "So roots bring the water up to the stem?" "That's impressive, Ethan." The boy's face lit up at the praise. He hadn't realized how much he craved that simple acknowledgement. For once, he felt like his father wasn't just present, but engaged. Nearby, Tyler approached, shoving his hands into his pockets. "Hey, Carter, your project's pretty good." His tone was casual, but the hint of respect was unmistakable. Ethan grinned awkwardly. "Thanks. Yours about volcanoes was cool too." Richard extended a hand toward Tyler. "And you must be Tyler. Ethan's mentioned you." Tyler blinked, startled by the formality, but shook his hand. Yeah. Nice to meet you, sir." Something shifted then. Ethan standing between his father and a friend, not as the isolated boy hiding in shadows, but as a child who was part of something larger. Richard caught the look in Ethan's eyes, a mixture of pride and belonging, and felt a pang of realization. His son didn't need him to fight every battle. He needed him to stand beside him, steady and present. Later, as the event wound down, Richard and Ethan walked across the parking lot together. The evening air was cool, filled with the hum of crickets. Ethan clutched the rolled-up poster in his hands, his steps lighter than usual. "Dad," he said suddenly, "today at the field trip, I told them to stop. I didn't cry. I told them I wasn't going to let them treat me that way anymore. Richard stopped, staring down at him. You did? Ethan nodded, his voice quiet but firm. Yeah. Tyler backed me up. But I spoke first. Pride surged through Richard's chest, overwhelming and unexpected. He knelt so his eyes were level with Ethan's. I'm proud of you. Do you hear me? Not because you stood up to them, but because you believed in yourself. Ethan's throat tightened. For so long he had wanted to hear those words, and now they came, not shouted in anger, but spoken with steady conviction. They continued walking, the silence between them no longer heavy but peaceful. For Richard, each step felt like building something new. Not an empire, not a contract, but a bond. A bridge that had been too long ignored. And for Ethan, walking beside his father felt different now. Not like being shielded or carried, but like being seen, as though they were finally moving in the same direction. The Carter offices once buzzed like a beehive, every phone call and email fueling the relentless chase for the next deal. But lately, Richard had changed the rhythm. He spent fewer nights under the fluorescent glow of boardrooms and more evenings at home, where laughter slowly began replacing silence. It hadn't been an easy shift. At first, investors bristled at his sudden boundaries. Meetings were rescheduled, dinners postponed. Some whispered that Richard Carter was losing his edge, but instead of fighting to prove them wrong, he adjusted. He delegated more authority to trusted executives, trimmed unnecessary expansions, and reshaped the company's calendar around a principle he had once ignored: family first. One Monday morning, as sunlight spilled into his office, Margaret visited him. She stood by the window looking out at the city that had once consumed her son. "You've built a fortune, Richard," she said, her tone softer than it had been in years. "But now you're learning how to build something far rarer." Richard glanced at her, eyebrow raised. "And what's that?" Her lips curved into a faint smile. "A home, a family, a son who trusts you." The words struck deep. For so long, he had thought success was measured in square footage and market dominance. Now, sitting behind his desk, he realized his mother was right. The true empire he wanted was smaller but infinitely more precious. At school, Ethan's teachers began to notice a change. He raised his hand in class, his voice still quiet but steady. He no longer slouched at his desk, no longer shrank when whispers followed him. The bullies kept their distance, not because they feared Richard, but because Ethan carried himself differently. Confidence, once fragile, had taken root. One afternoon, Ethan bounded into the living room with a grin. "Dad, I got an A on my science test." Richard looked up from the newspaper, a smile breaking across his face. "That's fantastic, Ethan. I knew you could do it." Ethan flushed with pride, the validation sinking deeper than he could put into words. For him, it wasn't just about the grade. It was about sharing the victory with someone who finally cared enough to notice. Evenings grew warmer. Margaret often joined them for dinner, filling the table with her stories. Richard listened, no longer distracted by buzzing phones. Ethan laughed more freely, his voice carrying through the mansion in a way it never had before. One night, after Ethan had gone to bed, Richard and Margaret lingered at the table. The dishes were cleared, the candles burned low. Margaret studied her son quietly before speaking. "You've changed," she said simply. Richard exhaled, leaning back. "I've lost deals, Mother. Investors are restless. Some think I've gone soft." Margaret reached for her glass of tea, her eyes steady. "And what do you think?" He thought of Ethan's laughter, the recital, the moment his son had stood tall against the boys on the field trip. "I think," Richard said slowly, "for the first time I'm not afraid of losing, not if it means keeping what matters." Margaret's smile deepened. "Then you've finally won." That night, as Richard checked on Ethan, he found his son asleep under the quilt Margaret had stitched years ago. The boy's breathing was steady, his face peaceful. Richard stood in the doorway, struck by the realization that this simple quiet was worth more than any skyscraper he could ever build. The journey hadn't erased the scars of the past, but it had forged something new, a bond that would carry them forward. Father and son no longer strangers under the same roof, but companions on the same path. And though challenges still loomed, Richard knew now that he would face them differently, not as a man obsessed with power, but as a father determined to be present. The summer sun spilled golden light across the Carter estate, warming the trimmed hedges and flowering gardens. Inside, laughter echoed through the halls, real laughter, not the hollow kind that once bounced off marble and vanished. Ethan sat cross-legged on the living room floor, sketching superheroes in a notebook, while Richard watched from the couch, a stack of unread business reports left on the coffee table. "Dad," Ethan said suddenly, holding up a drawing. "This one's you. See? Strong but not scary." Richard leaned forward, studying the crayon figure with its broad shoulders and kind smile. Something in his chest tightened. "I like him," he said softly. "He looks like someone I'd want on my side." Ethan grinned, tucking the notebook close as if it were a treasure. The boy who once trembled in silence had found his voice, and the father who once measured worth in contracts and towers had discovered the wealth hidden in presence. Margaret entered with a tray of lemonade, her eyes taking in the scene. "You've both come a long way," she said warmly. "This house finally feels like a home." Richard met her gaze, gratitude clear in his expression. "I should have listened to you sooner." She shook her head. "What matters is you listened at all. Some fathers never do." The words settled deep. Richard thought of the boardrooms he had once ruled, the investors who now whispered about his supposed weakness. But here, watching Ethan beam with pride, he understood that strength wasn't about intimidation or wealth. It was about choosing to be there when it mattered most. Later that evening they gathered in the backyard, fireflies flickering against the twilight. Ethan chased them across the grass, his laughter ringing like music. Richard stood beside Margaret, the smell of fresh-cut grass rising around them. "He's different now," Richard said quietly. "More confident, stronger." Margaret's smile was knowing. "Because he knows you see him. That's all a child truly wants." Richard nodded, his gaze fixed on Ethan. "I used to think giving him the world was enough, but all he ever needed was me." The night grew still, stars pricking the dark sky above. Richard felt a calm he hadn't known in years. For once, he wasn't thinking of stock prices or contracts. He was thinking only of the boy who had stood tall on a field trip and the man who had finally learned to stand beside him. As bedtime approached, Ethan tugged at his father's sleeve. "Dad, will you read with me tonight? Grandma's busy, but I want you to." Richard's heart swelled. "Of course," he said, placing a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "Let's pick a story together." They walked inside, side by side. In that simple act, Richard felt the full circle of their journey. The boy who once begged in tears now carried a quiet strength, and the father who once yelled now spoke with steady love. This was not the story of a man who built an empire. It was the story of a boy who reminded his father what truly mattered, and of a father who finally had the courage to change. And so, as Ethan drifted to sleep under the quilt, Richard whispered a promise he knew he would keep. "I'm here, son. Always." The empire outside might rise and fall, but within these walls, something stronger had been built. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. And when you're ready for the next chapter of inspiration, click on the suggested video that's waiting for you right now.